This tanzanite and diamond ring is set in platinum. The construction of this ring combines the traditional techniques of torch soldering and modern applications of arc welding. To make this ring, we start with a strip of 22 gauge platinum 8 millimeters wide. Mark the length and use a millimeter gauge to assist in drawing a square line. Saw the length and be sure to use lubricant on the blade. To determine the length of a ring blank, measure 40 millimeters for a size 0 and add 2.5 millimeters for every size. So for a size 10 ring, we need to make it 65 millimeters long. Using a file, trim the ends flush so that we will have a nice tight solder seam. Bend the strip around a ring mandrel to shape, and then using a pair of half-round flat-nose pliers, bend the ends together. I'm using plumb platinum solder to solder this. I wedged a couple of pieces of solder in the joint and heated the band to flow the solder. There was one area that wasn't quite flowed through, so we added a little piece of solder and completed the solder joint. File the insides of the ring to remove any excess solder. Place the band on a ring mandrel and using a non-marring hammer, straighten and shape the band to size. Then use a number 4 cut file and remove the excess solder from the outside of the band. Next, take a strip of the same platinum material, a little longer than the first strip, and bend it around the ring mandrel to shape it. Again, using a non-marring hammer, straighten it out and form to shape. We now have the 2 parts to form the shank. Take the inside sleeve and insert it into the outer band, and the tension of the outer band will hold it in place. Again, we use plumb solder to solder the seam closed. We need to solder the seam completely around on both sides of the ring, and as always, when using platinum solders, you need to protect your eyes with welding goggles, or in this case, we have a welding plate attached to the torch body with a clip. Take your time and keep adding small pieces of solder to get a completed solder joint all the way around the ring. Do this on both sides of the shank. Once we have it soldered, we need to file both sides to remove any excess solder and even up the 2 bands. Then file the inside edge of the ring to a 45-degree angle. Later, with sanding, this will round off and make a nice inside round band to be more comfortable to wear. Then take a short strip of the 8 millimeter platinum and with a dapping block curve it round, forming a semicircle. Using the shank of a ball punch makes a nice rod to use in the dapping block. Once we get the piece curved, we check it with the stone to make sure the size is correct. Then, using a pair of dividers, mark off the exact center. File a flat spot on that line to give us a larger surface area to solder to the ring shank. Then use dividers to mark the exact center of the opening on the shank and once again file a flat spot to give us more surface area to solder. Whenever working with platinum, be sure to keep your files and saw blades well lubricated. Fit the two parts together to make sure that they line up. Next, polish the inside areas now because they will be inaccessible once it is soldered together. We're using blue platinum polish, which is a one-step polish on a hard felt wheel. This blue polishing compound is somewhat abrasive to start with and will remove your sanding lines. Then, as you polish, the compound breaks down and starts burnishing and will give a nice polish. Once cleaned, the parts are lined up to be soldered. Here we've laid a piece of solder on the ring, and to keep from blowing it away, we hold it in place with a solder pick. We then turn the ring upright and place solder on the shelf and heat to solder the two ends together. Solder across the ends on both sides of the shank. Once the semicircle is soldered to the shank, use a saw to trim the ends of the fingers of the shank to length. File to true up the bands and to make sure they are flat and level. Remove any excess solder from the sides of the ring using a number 4 cut hand file. Use a number 6 cut needle file to remove the file marks. And then use 320 sanding paper to smooth and remove the file marks. We then use a satin finish brush in our micromotor to apply the finish to the outside of the shank. The sides of the shank are to be highly polished, so we begin with 400 grit paper. Hold the paper flat on the bench pin and rub the ring over it. Then move to 600 grit and examine between each step. Then go to 1200 grit and finally to 4000 grit to prepare the sides of the band for polishing. By using emery paper in this fashion, we can get a nice flat surface, and when polished it won't have any waviness from doing a lot of polishing. Using a small cylinder hard felt wheel, polish the inside of the semicircle and the inside of the ring shank. Next, take a strip of platinum to form the tubing and trim it to a point. Then use a dapping block to start rounding the strip to shape. Then pull the strip through a draw plate to make our tubing. Start at the largest hole in the draw plate and work your way down through smaller holes. Continue going down through smaller holes in the draw plate as the strip bends and forms the tubing. Continue until the size of the final tubing is reached. Place the tube in the dapping block to straighten it and remove any bends in the tubing. Cut off the tang that was used to draw the tube through the draw plate and mount the tube in a flux shaft and hold it against a bench pin while it turns to completely straighten it. Next, we need to solder the tube closed. Platinum solder doesn't flow as easily as gold, so this isn't quite as easy as soldering a gold tube, but it really isn't all that difficult. Start at one end and continue to add solder as you heat down the tubing. Then use a number 6 needle file to file off any excess solder. and put the tube in your flex shaft and turn it while holding it against a file to smooth out the tubing and remove any remaining solder. We then emery with a 320 sanding stick. Holding the tubing in the area where the spring is allows the sanding paper to bend and conform to the round tubing. Next, mark off a section of tubing with our dividers and hold a saw blade against the tube as we turn it in our flex shaft, cutting off the length of tubing that we need. Then mark for the second piece and cut it off in the same manner. Next, we need to set the diamonds. Mount the tube in the flex shaft and hold a setting burr against the rotating tubing we'll cut our seat. Then place the diamond in the seat with a wax stick and wipe a little bit of wax off onto the stone to help hold it in place. Then use a concave punch, and while rotating the tube slowly in the flex shaft, push in on the punch to start bending the ends of the tube down over the stone. Once the diamond is locked in place, use a burnisher and hold it against the rotating tubing to finish pushing it down tight on the stone, and to burnish the inside reflector ring that we want around the diamond. Turn the tubing around in the flex shaft and set the diamond in the same manner on the other end of the tubing. Then mount the second piece of tubing in the flex shaft and set both diamonds in it. Next, mount the tubing with the diamonds already set in jet set and mark off the center of the tubes. Carefully measure the width of the stone where the seat will make contact and mark this length on the tubing. I use a felt tip marker to mark off the ends of the tubing up to the seat, as this will make it easier to see while I'm cutting. Then with a 90-degree heart burr in the micromotor, cut the seat into the tubing. To cut a long line like this, you can gain the most control by grabbing the handpiece in your fingers and resting your thumb solidly on the block and pulling with your hand towards you. You want to cut towards you as the burr rotates to cut a nice straight line. The action is much like using a paring knife to peel an apple. Cut the seats in the tubing and test fit the tanzanite into the seat and adjust it until the stone fits securely. Then hold the tubing on the ends of the stone and place it on top of the shank and hold it in place with a small rubber band. Here I'm using a dental rubber band, the kind that are used in braces, as they're small and very strong. We then use the PUK-2 to weld the tubing to the ring shank. First, tack the tube on one side of the shank and examine it to make sure it is straight, and then push down tightly on the tubing and tack the other side. Once we have both of the tubes tacked on both sides of the shank, we can remove the rubber band and continue the weld all the way around the tubing. The thickness of the shank at the top is about 1.5 millimeters thick. The penetration of the PUK-2 is about 1 millimeter, and so we're using that little extra space to protect the tanzanite. We will not weld completely through because we do not want to damage the tanzanite. Once we have it welded onto the shank, examine it to make sure the welds are strong and everything is straight. And then file the weld joint to smooth it out and remove the roughness on the surface. Then remove the file marks with a small rubber wheel and smooth with a flat sanding stick. The flat sanding stick will leave a nice flat surface, and it will not be wavy like the rubber wheel would leave. We then need to replace the finish on the outside of the shank. Using my finger to protect the stone, I replace the satin finish on the outside of the ring shank. I then use a green silicone rubber wheel to lightly touch up the polish on the sides of the shank, and then examine the ring. A little cleaning and the ring is finished, ready to be worn by the customer.